The Briarwood estate was known for two things: its rose gardens that bloomed longer than they ought to, and the daughters who lived within its walls. One was admired, the other often overlooked. Olivia Briar turned heads wherever she went, with her sun-kissed hair, bell-like laugh, and a presence so naturally captivating it seemed divinely crafted to be adored. Evelyn, her older sister, had the unfortunate distinction of standing beside her. Evelyn bore a faint birthmark along her cheekbone, a slight limp from a childhood illness, and a quiet sort of grace that never demanded attention. She wasn't cruel or unkind or bitter. She simply existed in the shadows, and over time she found comfort there. When Lord Caleb Storm, heir to the vast Windermere estate, arrived in Wessex, everyone assumed his gaze would fall on Olivia. But as spring drew to a close, during a lively luncheon filled with laughter and lace, he stunned the room by requesting to court Evelyn. Lady Briar nearly choked on her tea. Olivia's smile vanished so fast it practically shattered. Evelyn simply blinked. The next day, in private, Lord Storm outlined his terms, quietly, directly, and without fanfare. A marriage of convenience, expected in the autumn. No need for romance, just mutual respect. When she didn't answer, he clarified with chilling calm, "You'll be well provided for. I require no affection." She nodded once, not from excitement, but from a quieter, steadier resolve. That evening, passing the library, she overheard him speaking to a friend. "She's unremarkable," he stated plainly. "That's what makes us safe. I have no interest in love. She won't ask anything of me." Evelyn didn't cry. She returned to her room and closed the door with a kind of quiet dignity that only women used to being overlooked truly understand. Over the next 2 weeks, he visited often. Mostly he spoke to her mother or wandered the estate. She watched from windows, never expecting much. Once he found her kneeling in the garden, silently pruning roses. "You garden?" he asked, as if startled. She didn't look up. "I prefer things that grow quietly." He didn't reply, but he watched her longer than necessary. That same week, he passed her in the corridor and paused. "I trust you're comfortable with the arrangements?" She looked him in the eye. "Comfort isn't a condition of marriage." Again, he said nothing. But later that day, she found her favorite book missing from the library. It returned the next morning, resting neatly on her writing desk, with a folded note tucked inside. In his handwriting, it read, "You are not unremarkable. I simply failed to look correctly." She didn't respond. But when he returned days later and offered to walk her to the conservatory, she said, "Only if you like." They walked together in silence, not close, not touching, but side by side. Evelyn knew what she was to him, a shield against heartbreak. And yet, when Olivia cornered him under the lanterns that evening, whispering, "You don't have to marry her," and he replied with steady resolve, "I've made my choice," something in Evelyn's chest shifted. Not warmth, not victory, just something noticed. Days passed. He asked her about the estate's finances. She surprised him with precise, thoughtful answers. He asked her why she agreed to the arrangement. She answered, "Because even unwanted things deserve to be chosen." And when he stood in the greenhouse doorway one morning and watched her quietly tending a broken orchid, he said, almost to himself, "You fix things most would discard." And she, without looking at him, replied, "Only the ones that still want to grow." He left shortly after. That night, she sat in the garden alone, and for the first time since her engagement, looked up at the stars not as a girl trapped by duty, but as a woman, quietly, stubbornly, beginning to matter. Not because he loved her, but because for the first time he had started to look. And that was enough for now. 3 weeks after the engagement, Evelyn found herself rising before dawn, not out of habit, but out of necessity. Her mother had grown more tense with each passing day, and Olivia's silence had become a weapon wielded in every shared room. Caleb, now visiting more regularly, spoke in clipped but polite phrases, never unkind, never warm. Evelyn didn't mind the lack of affection. What unsettled her was the precision with which he avoided it. He spoke to her as one might speak to a steward, respectful, reserved, and entirely detached. And yet, something began to change, not in words, but in glances. One morning she stood beneath the yew tree near the stables, brushing mud from her hem, when Caleb passed on horseback. He reined in for no reason she could see, merely watching her for a long moment before tipping his head and riding on. The next day, he asked her opinion on a tenant dispute regarding the eastern fields. She answered plainly. He seemed surprised, then thoughtful. Days later, he invited her on a walk without an audience. They spoke of nothing consequential: weather, the stubbornness of horses, the cost of glass. But the silence between their words softened. He asked what book she read. She asked why he avoided the piano. He told her, quietly, that music reminded him of a loss connected to deceit. She didn't press. That evening, he brought her a book she had mentioned in passing, a rare volume of essays she hadn't seen in years. He didn't say anything as he handed it to her. He simply placed it on her reading chair and left. The next morning, he was in the garden before she was, sleeves rolled, helping the gardener lift a fallen arch trellis. She paused on the steps, watching. He glanced up. "It looked like something worth saving," he said. She didn't reply. But that evening, she left a ribbon-wrapped bundle of lavender on the piano bench in the drawing room. He found it. No words were exchanged. That was their way now. Quiet gestures, things left behind for the other to find. The following week, Olivia returned from a visit to a cousin with sharper eyes and crueler observations. At dinner, she remarked loudly how strange it was that Caleb spent so much time discussing crops and tax ledgers with Evelyn. "Isn't that dreadfully dull?" she asked. Evelyn said nothing. Caleb looked across the table and said simply, "Not at all." It was the first time he'd ever defended her in public. Evelyn didn't thank him, but she met his eyes. And something passed between them, unspoken, soft, and undeniable. A few days later, as rain lashed the windows and most of the household took to their rooms, Evelyn stood beneath the portico holding a lantern and watching the water run through the gravel paths. Caleb joined her without a coat, without warning. "You'll catch cold," she said. "So will you," he replied. She turned toward him and asked, without pretense, "Why did you choose me?" He didn't answer at first. Then, "Because you felt safe. Because I didn't think you'd need anything from me." Her voice remained calm. "And now?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Now, I wonder if I'm the one who needed something all along." The rain softened, the wind stilled. She looked away first, but not because she wanted to. That night, he passed her in the hallway outside the library, their hands brushed. He stopped, but didn't turn. She didn't move. A long breath passed between them, but he kept walking. And that was the moment. In his hand it read, You said comfort isn't a condition of marriage, but I find I'm uncomfortable in your absence. No signature, no explanation. She folded it back, placed it in her pocket, and said nothing. But that evening she hummed softly while reading near the fire, and Caleb, sitting quietly across the room, listened without pretending not to. A true understanding. The wedding had been quiet, the vows spoken softly beneath stained glass and candlelight, with Evelyn's face veiled and Caleb's voice steady but distant. They didn't dine together that evening, nor did they share chambers. The house seemed to understand the arrangement and settled into a rhythm of silence and distance. Yet slowly, that silence began to change. Days passed with small gestures. A shared walk after supper, a note left folded beside the ledger, a cup of tea placed gently on a windowsill without explanation. And then she fell ill. It began as a chill, a fever that rose too quickly, and by the time the doctor had been summoned, Evelyn was already shivering beneath layers of quilts. Caleb never left her side. He read to her in the evenings, wiped her brow with a damp cloth, and whispered her name when she slept. One afternoon, as sunlight spilled across the floorboards and her fever finally broke, her eyes fluttered open, and for the first time, he truly looked at her. Not as the woman he'd married for duty, not as the sister who wasn't chosen, but as Evelyn. And in her eyes he saw something he had never noticed before. An expression so soft, so unguarded, it caught in his chest. Her features, no longer dulled by sickness or shadow, seemed to carry a quiet beauty that lived in the stillness of her presence rather than the loudness of her appearance. He leaned closer, his hand brushing the edge of her pillow, but stopped himself before their breath could meet. She blinked up at him, unsure, vulnerable, and in that moment, he drew back. Not because he wanted to, but because he feared she might think it was his guilt that moved him, not something real. After she recovered, their days began to shift. 4 months had passed since the vows, and with each week came a new ease between them. They spoke not just of the estate, but of childhood memories, books they both favored, and the quiet ways in which they moved through the world. She laughed once during supper, and he stared at her as if the sound rewrote something inside him. They spent mornings walking the orchard and evenings reading in the same room, sometimes in silence, sometimes in quiet conversation that lingered far past the need to speak. One night, while he sat alone in the library beneath the golden glow of a single lamp, Evelyn entered with a glass of water. She didn't speak at first, simply walked toward him with a grace that had become second nature. But when she handed him the glass, he caught her wrist gently, not with force, but with intention. Her eyes widened. He stood slowly and said her name in a voice he had never used before. "I owe you an apology," he began, jaw tight, eyes fixed on hers. "I married you out of fear. I thought if I chose someone who asked for nothing, I could avoid everything. But you were never nothing, and I think that might be the greatest cruelty of all." She didn't speak, but her lip trembled. He stepped around the desk, still holding her arm, and drew her into the soft space between them. "I've wronged you by being near and not with you, by needing you and pretending I didn't. Her breath hitched and she looked away. "I never wanted to be a duty," she whispered. "You never were," he said. "You became my clarity." And then her composure broke, years of dismissal and restraint rising to the surface in silent tears. She wept, not loudly but fully, shoulders trembling beneath his hands. He said nothing more. He didn't kiss her. He didn't press his cheek to hers. He simply wrapped his arms around her and held her as if that was all he had ever meant to do. And in that quiet room, with only the fire crackling and the dust of unspoken things hanging in the air, something between them finally settled, not into passion, but into presence. And that, for Evelyn, was enough for now. The days after the night in the library unfolded like silk, slow, warm, and threaded with something unspoken that neither dared define but both felt as surely as breath. Caleb no longer watched her from across the room. He looked at her directly now, openly, as if seeing her was something he had been denying himself for too long. And Evelyn no longer waited to be invited. She entered rooms like she belonged there. They didn't discuss the tears she shed in his arms that night, nor the way he had held her like someone precious. But the silence between them had changed. It was no longer the silence of strangers. It was the silence of intimacy. By the 5th month, their routines had become rituals. Breakfast